Hi, and welcome. Today I'm talking with Professor Howard Williams. We've actually done an interview with him on the early medieval public archaeology, and today's a whole new topic. I've also split this episode in half to make it a little easier to listen to. As you know, I love interviewing students, scholars, amateurs, academics, and so many more. And it's great to have a guest come back again. Also, I'm a francophone from Canada. My name is Rosie, and this is my podcast. I guess now we're digging into history, eh? Today I'm talking with Professor Howard Williams. Thank you for being here and talking to us.
Hello, Rosie. Yes, we're going to talk about the dig. And there are many archaeological digs, but at the moment, everyone is thinking and talking about and tweeting about one dig in particular, and that's the film, The Dig. This come out this year on Netflix, and it's already getting massive positive reviews and lots of passionate interest because it's based on real events. It's based on an actual archaeological excavation. In fact, I actually think it's the first ever big film, ever produced that attempts to, represent an archaeological excavation that actually happened in detail. And there's so many fictional ones. But anyway, so that's The Dig, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And it's all based on the 1939 excavations at the famous early Anglo-Saxon burial site of Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, England.
So when they started this, if we're talking in the historical sense,
they
didn't know what they were going to find. This was all very big surprise.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So perhaps I could start off by explaining what we now know about Sutton Hoo, and that'll explain why The Dig is such an important film and it's such an interesting moment, because this is actually the heart of one of the key things I study about the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. One of the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that emerged after the collapse of the Roman province of Britain in the early to mid 5th century AD is the East Anglian kingdom. And the site of Sutton Hoo we now know as a princely burial site of perhaps one of the dynasties, or the dynasty that became predominant and took forward the East Anglian kingdom in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. And so we now know of it as a unique and amazing site where we have burial mounds dating to the period perhaps just before Christian conversion, where these Germanic-speaking early Anglo-Saxon kings were forging territorial power bases. And in this case, they were stretching their influence across the modern counties of Norfolk and Suffolk in the east of England. And perhaps at times they were extending their power far across lowland Britain beyond that through diplomacy, but also through warfare. And the East Anglian kings seem to be burying their dead in these massive burial mounds at Sutton Hoo. Now, we know about this site from multiple excavations. We now know that people were digging into these burial mounds, and by a burial mound, I mean a huge, great mound of earth. And these are substantial in size. And we now know there's at least 18 of these burial mounds. And we now know from modern excavations that this site was one perhaps of a series of burial sites along the ridge to the east of the estuarine river Deben. So it's a big wide estuary that stretches in from the North Sea, and on a ridge to its east there would have been this line or multiple lines of burial mounds. And they started, we know about these, well, we don't know about these, but we know now that the first excavations into them were in the 16th or 17th centuries. There's then an account from the 1860s, I think it is, but of another intervention. But the famous excavations first took place on the grounds owned by Edith Pretty, who was a widow, and she was very inspired by spiritualism. There is one account she even had a vision of the biggest of the burial mounds and riders riding round it, and she had this sort of kind of precognizance of the presence of something important in this burial mound. And so she hired a local amateur archaeologist called Basil Brown to investigate these burial mounds. And those are the famous excavations. And in 1938, Basil Brown went to the site and he decided to dig 3 burial mounds. And he didn't go for the biggest one, assuming that that one had already been ransacked and rifled. And he was right to think that, because later we found that robbers in past centuries had dug a central trench to try and find a burial chamber and treasures in that mound. And he didn't go for that one straight away, even though Edith Pretty wanted him to. And he excavated mounds that we now call Mound 2, Mound 3 and Mound 4. Now, obviously, in 1938, he didn't call them Mound 2 and 3 and 4, but they've become known as that. And he excavated in 1938, and he had mixed results. He had a lot of trouble digging into the sandy soil, very sandy soil. He found different things in these burial mounds. They were all disturbed in different degrees, all been broken up and damaged by previous ransackings. In mounds 3 and 4, he found traces of cremation burials. So they burnt the body and collected up parts of the ashes, and he was just finding traces of this calcined bone. In one, they buried the dead on a oak tray, or perhaps part of a dugout boat. We're not sure. And that's shown in the film, and I'll come on to that. That's in Mound 3. And he also found with that some really interesting objects that he didn't really know what they were, but we now know they're really exciting in themselves. The lid of a bronze ewer, like a large jug that would have come from the Byzantine Empire, and a fragment of limestone plaque. And also, he found these objects, with the cremated remains and this sort of this tray, as well as an axe head, as an iron axe head, a Francisca, we'd call that, a throwing axe. And so he found this, and at the time we didn't have a bone analysis, but we now know that that individual would have been a cremation of a man, an adult male, and a horse. So they'd sacrificed a horse and burnt that as well. But he didn't know that at the time. Then he had dug another mound. Mound 4, he contained what we now know is the cremated remains of a man and a woman and a horse, and playing pieces, gaming pieces that had been placed with the dead in a bronze bowl. So they cremated somebody and collected them into a bronze bowl, put a cloth over the top and put that in the mound. So bronze bowls, sacrificing horses, playing pieces, bits of imported exotica. This is high status for the early Anglo-Saxons. Those 2 burials alone were crying out, this is special. And though cremation has destroyed the remains, he would have known, even as an amateur, this is something exciting. And then Mound 2 was even more interesting for Brown. He found it was heavily damaged, and he misunderstood the dig. He thought there was a burial in a little boat because he found iron rivets. And we now know that actually he'd misunderstood it because it was re-excavated later, and I'll come on to that. We now know that Mound 2 was an inhumation under a ship. They dug a burial chamber and then pulled a big seagoing vessel over the top. But he didn't quite understand that because he misunderstood an earlier robber trench as the edges of a small little dinghy. So he misunderstood it, but he found traces of a drinking horn, a bit of a bucket, a cauldron, a bronze bowl, a blue glass jar, a silver-mounted box, a silver-mounted cup, knives, and a sword and a shield. So really amazing high status stuff, but damaged, broken, robbed, and in a mess. And if Basil Brown had stopped digging in 1938, those 3 burials today, if no one else had excavated the site, we would still be saying this is an amazing site. We wouldn't have the fame. Sutton Hoo wouldn't be famous like it is now, but from an archaeologist within the archaeological world, those would be 3 top-notch, exciting burials. But he came back in 1939. She brought him back for a second season on the eve of the Second World War. Basil Brown came back and had a go at excavating Mound 1. And he kept going because he discovered another ship. And he was aware from a nearby site found in the 19th century at Snape that ship burial was an early Anglo-Saxon thing. And he was quite a well-educated man, self-taught, and he'd already read up on the Ossebaya ship from Norway. And he was aware of the Snape discovery. And he knew that this could be a Viking or Anglo-Saxon vessel, and he found the edge of this massive ship, and he kept going, he kept pulling it apart and excavating, and it got the attention of the local museum, but it also got the attention of Charles Phillips at Cambridge, Selwyn College, Cambridge, who came along and in shock realized the scale of what was being found. And basically there's nuances to the story, but basically took over the dig from Brown, said, you can't do this anymore, we're bringing in, and he pulled in all his favours as an university academic to get what is now seen as like an all-stars dream team of mid-20th century archaeologists, as names that are, famous. So it's like a Marvel Avengers film where they sort of pull in all the celebrities and they're all there starring and still starring and also starring. And so you had OGS Crawford, you had William Grimes, you had Peggy Piggott and Stuart Piggott, and you had, among others, also Charles Phillips, and there were others too. And all of this was done in a rush, a panic, with no money and with no time to excavate what they knew was going to be an exceptionally big ship, and the possibility that at the centre there could be an undisturbed burial chamber. And they were proved right. It was a phenomenal find. The burial chamber in the ship at Mound 1 was untouched. The robbers had missed it. They hadn't dug deep enough, and they dug off centre. And they found it's the largest and wealthiest assemblage of grave goods found from any period of time from the island of Britain. And it is the richest, therefore, early Anglo-Saxon 6th, 7th century burial. And the objects contained, you can see in the British Museum. The National Trust now own the site, and you can visit and see replicas and a museum there. And those finds are famous. Everybody knows the Sutton Hoo helmet, as reconstructed and on display in the British Museum. It's on the front of so many history books. It's an icon of England, London, Britain, history. You can see world books of history. It'll be one of alongside Stonehenge, Tutankhamun, the Sutton Hoo helmet. It's one of perhaps a top 20 of European, at least, iconic objects. But there's much more than the helmet. And you've got to remember that the helmet was not reconstructed until 1945, 1946. So the helmet, they didn't sort of pick up this helmet and go, oh, look, the helmet. No, that was just a mess of hundreds of fragments. But they did find gold and garnet jewellery of an exceptional quality, a pair of shoulder clasps, a purse. They also found a sceptre, a strange sceptre, a whetstone, a ceremonial whetstone, a iron standard. So objects of regalia that people immediately started thinking, well, this could be kind of a bling of a king. This is the stuff that, only someone of high status ceremonial function would have. They also found weaponry. So there were spears. There was an amazing shield at the head of the grave. There was a sword, and there was a unique all iron axe hammer. So it has an axe at one side, a hammer at the other, and it's got an all iron shaft. And so that is almost exceptional. We've never found anything like that in Britain. So you've got an amazing sword with gold and garnet hilt. You've got a shield, and a mail shirt as well. So there was weaponry, there was regalia, but that was not all. There was a set of silver vessels that had come from the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Byzantine Empire. There were bronze hanging bowls, 3 of them. We've never had a burial with 3 bronze hanging bowls. And these were probably made in modern day Scotland, from Pictish territories. We also have amazing other objects, some humble objects too. But, we have maplewood cups. We have a lamp that must have been lit for this grave. We have a pottery flask, some more modest things, gaming set of gaming pieces. So, those are just some of the 250 plus objects found in the burial chamber. And they found the chamber. They found that this has all been buried in a sort of miniature house, a little chamber set into the ship. Like the dead person was going off to the next world or was living somehow in that mound. And all of this had been found in very poor state of preservation, and there was no very good bone preservation. They didn't find evidence of sacrificed horses, cows, sheep, goats, pig, dogs, as we do find in other graves, and they found no body. And it was thought for a long time it was a cenotaph, that this rich assemblage had been buried with the dead because they didn't have the body. But no, phosphate analysis later found that there were traces of a body, but the acid soil had eaten it away. So Mound 1, Basil Brown was knocked aside, and this internationally famous dream team, as they were going to become, took over the dig. And Brown was allowed to still work on the site and deal with the ship, but he wasn't allowed in the burial chamber by the university-based academics. And there were tensions about that. And there's recorded in diaries that Brown didn't quite like Phillips. And I can imagine there was a class tension, and there was a personality tension. And like, if ever you've been digging on any archaeological feature and someone comes and takes over it, be it a rich chamber grave, be it a small pit full of cess material, you are angry that someone has chucked you off it. It becomes personal. So you can understand that. Anyway, this story hit the papers. It became a massive story. I had to have a policeman guarding it 24/7 just in case someone tried to rob it. They had to rush it because war was coming. War was literally coming. People were being called up. Any adult male was being called up in some regard into the armed services, or they were really worried about what was going to be happening, and they were rushing. And they managed to get the dig. There was a coroner's inquest. It was declared not treasure trove, meaning in terms of the law as it was, and up to 1996, it was declared to be the owner of the landowner. It was decided this was not a hoard buried with the intention of recovery. If it had been, then the Crown would have owned it in British law. It was decided it was the landowners. So Mrs. Pretty, the coroner, decided, because it was a burial and the poem Beowulf was read out at the coroner's inquest to give an illustration of early Germanic funerals and that this was not intended for recovery, to prove that this was a funerary deposit. So it's not treasure under law. And Mrs. Pretty got it, and she did something exceptional, and we still don't know exactly why. She decided to give it to the nation for nothing. And she gave it to the British Museum. She stipulated it had to go to the British Museum, the place where most people could see it, as said in the film. But she also stipulated that replicas had to be made available for Ipswich Museum, the local museum. So this was astounding. This was called the £1 million grave in the papers at the time. And it was probably, if it had been sold, if she'd tried to sell it, it would have been probably more than £1 million. But that was the newspaper headline: Saxon chieftain, £1 million grave. And she got it, and she could have kept it. She could have sold it to a rich American. She could have kept it. She could have whatever. But she decided to give it to the nation. She turned down, I think it was an OBE that was offered to her for that act. And the British Museum has never had, and never has since had, such an act of generosity of a single gift to the British Museum. So it went into the underground in storage. It went immediately to London, and immediately they took it out of the British Museum and stuffed it in an underground train station with most of the other materials from the British Museum to wait out the war from the Luftwaffe's bombing. And it survived the war. And then in 1945-46, the British Museum began the long job of reconstructing the grave. And so they started that work, and the work lasted until the 1970s. And they finally started publishing the results in the 1970s through to the 1980s. And all that time, these finds had been on display. They did further excavations in the 60s because the ship had been left open by Brown. He hadn't had time to rebuild the mound. In fact, tanks were driven over the mounds as British Army practice site, and they'd gone over the ship. And I should have explained, I didn't earlier. When I say they found a ship, they found the shadow of a ship. Of the wood had changed, stained the soil. They found the clench nails, the iron clench nails that held the timbers together. So you had the shape of a ship, but the wood had been turned to stained sand. So this was a very fragile thing in itself, 27-metre long ship. And it stayed there covered in bracken, and things were driven over it. So the British Museum went back in the 60s and did a proper topographic survey. They did more excavation, and they planned the ship properly. And then a whole other story I could tell you about was in the 1980s through to 2001, a proper modern excavation took place, led by Professor Martin Carver, that excavated half of the rest of the site, the rest of the burial mounds. And he found most of them robbed, but he found a whole host of other new burials, disturbed and damaged, but revealing new evidence of the rest of the burial mounds. And they're all late 6th, 7th century. There's other exciting finds from the site I could talk about another time. There's later execution graves. And there's a Bronze Age field systems he found underneath. There's lots of things to talk about. But in terms of this site, he was able to put Mound 1 in context, and he was able to do a proper excavation. And in the, I think, penultimate season, they did something exceptional. They found one burial that was under a mound that was so shallow, no grave robbers had noticed it before. And they dug down and found twin pits. And I'll come back to this. I was working on this season, and I was working on these graves. And they came down and they found a horse in one pit, and they found an intact adult male weapon burial, intact, undisturbed, in the other pit. So actually, that's the second only undisturbed burial at Sutton Hoo, was Mound 17, excavated in 1991 by the Martin Carver field season. And he found a much poorer but still lavish, rich weapon burial with a comb, a sword, a shield, a bowl, and so on. in a coffin or something, some kind of constructions around, maybe we call it coffin, but that's a bit anachronistic, but some kind of container. And the robbers had missed that one because there was a pair. The horse had been put to the north of the mound to the south, and the robber trench that tried to rip it out in the 16th, 17th century had gone to the centre, logically thinking there'd be a burial there. So we have two lucky cases where robbers hadn't found these burials, and that was excavated in very sophisticated modern conservation methods and analysis, and the rest of the site has been revealed. So we have not every barrow has been dug. We now think there's about 18 mounds, and 10 have now been excavated at Sutton Hoo. And Martin Carver's excavations made sure they didn't dig the whole site. But now we have a much better understanding of the broader archaeology of Sutton Hoo. But it all stems from that Basil Brown 1938-1939 famous excavations producing the Sutton Hoo treasure. I'm gesticulating with quote marks of caution that it's often called treasure. It's sometimes even called a hoard, even though it's not. It's a grave goods placed with at least one dead person as part of a funerary ritual. Some of the objects are lavish and you'd call treasure because they're precious metal, but there's many of the objects are made of wood, horn, textile, as well as silver, gold, iron, bronze and so on. So it's a rich range of a burial assemblage, a burial fit for a king. And I'll end with the point that we don't know the identities of any of these individuals beneath these mounds, but we think that it's the early Anglo-Saxon dynasty of the Wuffingas, who, and one of their kings that we think is most likely, most others would argue, is the occupant of Mound 1, was King Redwald, who was recorded by the Venerable Bede a century later as a Bretwalder, as an overking, a ruler of great power. And Bede hates him. Bede is a Northumbrian monk writing about the pagan kings of old and how they converted to Christianity. And all he cares about is who were the good kings? Well, the good kings are the Northumbrian kings, even if they were pagan, because they're the ancestors of the patron of my monastery. So I have to say the Northumbrian pagan kings are great. Even when they slaughter monks, they probably deserved it because the pagan king is Northumbrian doing the slaughtering. That's his angle. But also, he didn't like, sorry, but forgive the pun, that was his angle, because they were all angles. But the other king he didn't like was Redwald, because Redwald had accepted Christianity from Ethelbert of Kent, the first Christian king of the Anglo-Saxons, the king of Kent. He'd accepted Christianity, but he let his wife talk him out of it. Now, in classic misogynistic fashion, Bede doesn't even bother mentioning the Queen, who talked Redwald out of return to the worship of devils, as Bede remembers it. So the only thing that Bede wants to tell us about is that Redwald was a bit of an apostate. He accepted the true faith, according to Bede, and then denounced it again. But he does record his military power and his strength and prestige. So he's one character that maybe the body that's been eaten away by acid, but whose grave goods were strewn in this burial chamber that Basil Brown excavated in the centre of a ship, and that Charles Phillips then took forward this excavation and revealed just at the outbreak of the Second World War. And the site, as I said, is a bigger story, but just to wrap up the story, it's important to say that historically, Mrs. Pretty, whose land was commissioned on, she never got to see any of this. She got to see it come out of the ground, but she never got to see the reconstructed helmet. She never got to see the reconstructed bronze bowl. She never got to see it in the British Museum because it all started being displayed at the British Museum 1947-48, and she had died sadly in 1942. So her legacy is this wonderful, it's the centre of the Sutton Hoo in Europe exhibition in the British Museum. And still one of the thing I go to see, who cares about everything else? Go and see the Sutton Hoo treasure, and it's a centerpiece, and it deserves to be because it is an exceptional burial, and it appeals to people today for many reasons. It's an exceptional find. It tells us a glimpse at early England. It shows that it really changed. It was a game changer in archaeological and historical thinking, because until then, the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were seen as really primitive, really backward, and suddenly we saw a burial that showed all these connections with the Frankish world, with the Scandinavian world, with the Byzantine world, kings that had power and authority, and it suddenly shifted our understanding. And it's also important because it's the earliest burial of an English royal. So it has that, for those that are into kingly history, political history. It is a starting point of English kingship. It's a bit of a over exaggeration. It's not really, but for simple terms, it appeals to people in that way. And it also appeals to people because it's a king on the cusp of Christianization. It's a kingdom in tension. It's looking south and east towards Francia and the Christian kingdoms of the Franks and in Kent. And it's looking north and east towards Scandinavia and the pagan world. And it's a ship burial, so it's a foreshadowing of the Viking Age as well, and the connections around the North Sea before the Viking Age. So there's so many reasons people love and are fascinating by the individual finds, the burial assemblage, the story of early England, the story of East Anglia, kingship, Christian conversion, but not quite yet. So it's on the verge of so much. It's a story of becoming, and many people do see it in a very emotional way as a story about the origins of England. And of course, people do make the constant connection to the fact this was being found right at the start of the Second World War, where Germanic invaders past had made England what it is, and yet Germanic invaders present were very much a real and present danger, and for not only England in small terms, but for Western democracy per se. And you can characterize the Second World War in all sorts of ways, and I'm not trying to be over patriotic. I'm trying to say that is the way it has been perceived. I'm not saying that's the way I perceive it. I'm saying that is the way it's often been seen, that this is a very evocative and almost patriotic excavation, but not because they thought of it in that way, but it became that because of what the war did to it. It became almost reburied almost immediately again, entombed in stasis, to then rise again into the British Museum afterwards. I hope that's not too poetic, but I think it has captured the imagination for that reason as well.
Absolutely. I have a really funny question, but how did the name Sutton Hoo get put on this site?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. It's a Hoch place name, and this is an Old English place name element meaning a rise or a promontory. So we have it's very difficult to do it without maps. So you have to imagine a wide open estuary. So when the sea comes in, it's brackish, water is flooding up, it's very open. And then it's got, at this point, the river changes direction. So it's heading out from a relatively small river out and becomes an estuary just a few miles to the north. And then it's heading southwest, but then it changes direction and heads towards the sea southeast. And at this point, there's on the left-hand side as you're going downstream, so that's the east side, there's these multiple promontories with combes going up between them. And these are the horse, the hose, these sort of, and even in the Suffolk dialect, it's still a Sutton Ho. You don't say, well, Sutton Hall, not Sutton Hoo, as in a sort of posh English who, as in woohoo, as in who is that? It is Hall, and it's like it's basically a promontory, a ridge sticking out from higher land out into the estuary. And this was a very careful positioning. Sutton simply means the southern tune, the southern farm. So it's the hose of the southern farm, and the farm nearby is called Sutton. So the Sutton place name then became a parish in the 12th, 13th century, preserving a name that referred to an earlier relationship with usually a Norton, a north farm that's elsewhere. It doesn't always have to have a north farm. It can have an east and a south. But, my point is it's a description of later centuries in the Anglo-Saxon period where there was an estate system set up, and that was the southern farm. And this is the hose on the southern farm, the promontories. So some people have thought it comes from hlaw, which is Old English for burial mound. And they said that these are the burial mounds of Sutton. No, it comes from the natural topography. But the natural topography is not irrelevant because it's on this site, this hose, that the Anglo-Saxons seem to have built these prominent burial mounds so that they're overlooking the river, so you can see the tidal river from them. And when you're sailing along the river, or rowing most likely, or just being taken by the tide down, you are seeing these mounds dominating the view of the river. And the river is important. It's important for communications. It may have been an important boundary with the East Saxon kingdom. So it may have been a political boundary at this point. So it's an artery of communication. It's a boundary. And the mounds may be as much there to project the presence of the dead to neighbours and enemies as much as to be a homely friendly, like, oh, we've got our big rich farmstead and our estate, and we've got our burial mounds in the back garden. No, these are prominent. These are public facing, is the term you'd call it today, extrovert monuments. They are out there dominating that landscape, and they would have been seen. If you go to Sutton Hoo today, to the National Trust site, there's a 19th century conifer plantation that blocks the view of the river, but historically you would have had clear sights of these burial mounds, and they may have had posts on top of them. The ship may have had its mast up, so they may have even been originally intended to mark that there's a ship there with a mast. Not a full size mast of the sophistication of a Viking age longship, but still a mast that would be an assistance on the open seas if you had the wind in your favour, and it wasn't so strong as to break it. So, you know, they would have been mainly a rowing boat, but with the ability to perhaps put up a smaller sail to assist. And they would have had to have pulled the ship up to that ridge from the river. So the river is part of the ceremony of the funeral. At least 2 funerals had ships buried on that ridge, and the others would have been associated with great cremation ceremonies involving fire, animal sacrifice. So it's like a public theatre for the funeral and then for the burial mounds. And so that's where the place name comes from.
I guess it's kind of like marking a grave with a gravestone, right? You're wanting to know where that is.
It's marking it, but on a scale that, I mean, apart from the most grandiose of 19th century mausolea and, you know, these very few people get a gravestone that you'd be able to see from 5 miles away or even 3 miles away, you know, as a landmark. In a modern analogy, I don't know about your particular part of the world, but certainly in the UK, some of the Jubilee monuments of the 19th century, some of the war memorials built on the heights above a town, we have in some parts. It doesn't happen like that everywhere in the UK. It depends on how individual communities decided to memorialise the First and Second World Wars. But that's the analogy. It's like monuments that sort of project out long distance so everyone can see them when they're coming along through the territory. So, there is an amazing sight. But, you know, when I say this, I don't want to give you the impression it's like kind of Tolkien-esque landscape of dramatic hills. This is very low-lying, subtle landscape. But still, within that subtle topography, they were making statements.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of them building on hillsides, their forts or castles or whatnot.
Yeah, it's almost like dominating that landscape. Yeah, wanting people to remember who's buried there. Of course, we've lost their names, but presumably people would have remembered the funeral, but then also remembered the named mounds. So you had a sequence of kings. And Tolkien took that idea for his Riders of Rohan. When Aragorn and the rest of them are riding up to Edoras, they pass by the burial mounds and one by one marking kings. And Tolkien was writing this after the discovery of Mound 1. He'd had a copy of Antiquity. He'd read about the Charles Phillips's excavation report. So that idea would have played in his mind about the idea of a succession of barrows on a ridge, I think. And he probably got that idea from elsewhere as well. But that's one of the
And I guess to wrap up this section on Sutton Hoo, the actual dig, I always think a bit historically on my end. So what did all of this create historically? Did we find out new things about the Anglo-Saxons and maybe their culture, their tradition, or? Yeah.
Well, there's still debates about whether it can be rightly called a pagan grave and whether it can be called. There's been there's shifting debates about how we interpret the site, as with everything. Martin Carver is very much a strong opinion in following his excavations that the East Anglian Kingdom was like defiantly pagan expressions of its kingship through an experimental set of funerary rituals that were trying to sort of stand off against Christian kings who were doing things following a new religion. I think we can see it as more of a slightly differently, but I'm very influenced by his ideas, and I think this idea that these are political rhetoric, these are statements of power by kings who may have not fully achieved that power. That we're not seeing wealthy burials in this late 6th and early 7th century because everyone had achieved a full territorial dominance of their kingdoms. They were very insecure crisis monuments that are asserting authority. Very much like, to use crude analogies, if you think of early medieval leaders like petty warlords or drugs barons, they are using their funerals to make audacious, ostentatious, and memorable events that are not only expenditures of material goods, but performances, and that they are trying to do this to consolidate power that they don't quite have yet. And Christianity proves a better strategy, in part, to achieve that power over a bigger territorial span, and allows them to invest in monasteries and invest in a ritual system that allows them to consolidate that power. But they didn't know that at that time. We can't back project. So I think we see this as an experimental stage in funerary expenditure by kings who are making it up as they're going along. And that's why I'm very cynical about seeing them as pagan, because pagans have been around for a long time not doing this, or pre-Christians were allowed. It's not something that everyone was doing it. And I find it hilarious when people use Mound 1 in isolation to say this is what Anglo-Saxon kings did. No, this is what one crazy dude did, or what his, actually not what he did, but what his descendants did. Right, and no one tried it before, and no one thought of it afterwards. And you could make an argument, no one has dared to, that this was just a big embarrassment of a guy no one liked, and everyone thought, well, he said he wanted all these. Oh, what does he want now? What's he say? Oh, is he dead yet? No, what's he saying now? Oh, he wants all the silver in the grave. Right, yeah, Dad. Right, okay, and yeah, well, we'll have to do it. He wants it. Or whatever. You can almost make the argument out that it was over the top. It took it too far, and there's no other burial like it because there was nothing left to bury. Or there's lots of different ways of seeing it. Historically, though, it is a moment or a process over about 50 years or 60 years where we see the East Anglian dynasty using their funerals to make grandiose statements about their identity. And my point is simply, it may not say, oh, status that I have, it's power that I want. And it's aspirational. So I think that's the big story I take away from it, although different scholars will pitch the burials in a slightly different way, and you'll read things very differently in different sources. But I think the point is this is a really exciting and dynamic time for early English kingship and territorial kingship emerging. And these are rival kingdoms, so they're all trying to play off each other. That's the big historical moment, I think, the late 6th and early 7th century as a time of kingdoms, not necessarily forming, but trying to form.
Absolutely. Yeah, that does sound like it's quite important to understanding or even having theories on what's going on.
And this really changed this. And there's other burial sites known. And there are other sites. We have other wealthy burials, and most recently, you'll be perhaps your listeners will be aware of the King of Bling, the Prittlewell Prince, a chamber burial found ahead of road construction, 17, 18 years ago in Prittlewell in Essex. And we think this is a burial of the late 6th century, perhaps of the whoever was buried in Mound 1's father's or grandfather's generation, but a rival dynasty, perhaps the East Saxon kings. And it's been suggested possibly a number of East Saxon kings whose names come down to us, it may have been. But the point is, all these kingdoms were doing over 2, 3, 4 generations, were experimenting in exorbitant inhumation burials or cremation burials. And at Sutton Hoo, they can't make up their mind which they want to use. They're using both.
Yeah, because the way that Christians were being buried and the way that, as to take the term you use, the pagan, the pre-Christians, they do have differences in the way that they were being buried. So it's quite interesting to compare that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this site is exceptional. And I mean, that's why I think the new movie, The Dig, is such a moment for us to finally get a fictional account of these amazing discoveries, and to have that projecting out to a wider audience, and especially valuable at a time when the lockdown means that the tourist industry, the heritage industry is on its knees. The National Trust in the UK has been under massive criticism for daring to suggest that some of its properties have slaving links, and that's caused a massive political storm. And I'm cancelling my subscription to the National Trust because they have dared to mention that maybe a statue of a slave on a fountain is offensive, and maybe we need to actually be aware that some of these massive houses are owned by huge, great, whopping sugar plantation owners, or whatever it may be, and they're trying to, in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, they're trying to research and educate people about these deep links, and this is causing a massive storm in the UK at the moment. And we need these stories, are positive stories, not denying the horrors of the past, but to engage people alongside those other conversations, I think. And I think that's why I think this movie release is important. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And the other reason is that the film is so touching in its treatment of mortality. And I think that's why people at this time feel particularly a film about the eve of war, when people are struggling against their personal ill health, as Edith Pretty is shown as a very ill woman, and Basil Brown as a perhaps elderly, humble, this touches a resonance with, I think, where we are as in our position in the middle of a lockdown. And I think that's why it's appealing to people as well. That's what I think is going on. And so the film tells us about the dig, but it also chimes with so much else going on in our society at the moment.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the time you took to explain the Sutton Hoo archaeology dig. And now, for those who want to continue, part 2, we will talk about the movie, as well as Professor Williams' own experiences. But, as usual, I'd like to thank my husband Jamie, our brood of kids, our family, our friends, and the teachers that have helped me so much. Without you, I wouldn't be adventuring through history. Un grand merci.